Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me this evening to speak about the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. We're going to speak about BDS. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, international law, the malicious charge of apartheid against Israel, and intersectionality. And you need to understand all of these because they're all intertwined. So the first thing is, before we begin, we need to have all of the facts. We live in a world, unfortunately, where people seem to be entitled to their own set of facts. So because BDS is about ending Israel and delegitimizing its right to exist, we need to understand contemporary anti-Semitism, from the right, from the left, and from Islam, international law, the charge of apartheid, intersectionality, and we need a short history of the legitimacy of the state of Israel. It seems crazy that we have to talk about one of the nations in the world having to fight for its legitimate right to exist, but that really gets to the heart of what BDS is trying to say, that Israel doesn't have a legitimate right to exist. So over the years, when I've spoken at organizations, at universities, these are some of the nastiest falsehoods that have been said from the BDS crowd, that Israel's an apartheid state. And I'm going to break many of these down for you so you'll feel confident in debunking them when you get confronted by them. Israel is ethnically cleansed the indigenous people. Israel is a Nazi racist state. Israeli Arabs have no rights. Israel is the primary problem of the Middle East. The Holocaust was an exaggeration. And you say to yourself, wow, this just can't be. But unfortunately, this is the heart of the BDS movement. I hope as we get further along, I'll be able to get into why I think that is a fair assessment. So we're going to take about 2 minutes now. I want to show you my friend and colleague who did a documentary about BDS to give you a feeling about BDS on university campuses. So this is Ami Horowitz.
I'm Ami Horowitz, and I'm here in the Pacific Northwest, the American home of the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. I want to see if these guys are willing to take it to the next level. We're raising money for American Friends for Hamas. So I work for American Friends for Hamas. I work for American Friends for Hamas. Okay. We're not your father's terrorist organization. We've kind of evolved beyond that. Still kind of what we do, but we've kind of rebuilt and rebranded ourselves. And Hamas is where it's at. We're raising money to do what we do as Hamas. We want to fund operations against Israel. And the type of attacks we're talking about are cafes and schools and soft targets. Type of operations we're talking about against soft targets, schools and cafes and that kind of thing. Make them feel it. Hospitals and destroy cafes, shopping malls and schools and places of worship. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. Civilian populations. And this is the only way we can fight back, really. The suicide bomber is all we've got. That's kind of like, because it's the poor man's F-15. Right. And do what we can against Israel. And that's kind of what we're looking to do. Thanks for your time. And fund operations against Israel. That's the kind of thing we're doing.
Okay. Well,
hey, thanks for your time, man.
Yeah, of course.
Appreciate it. Good luck. Thank you. We're essentially the logical extension of BDS. It's like BDS the next level. That's what we're doing. We're kind of like the next level BDS. It's like BDS, and then we're like BDS plus. We're looking to wipe Israel off the map. Yeah, we want. We're looking to destroy Israel. We don't want just Gaza. We want to have all of Israel.
I've actually been learning about in this last school year about everything that's going on over there. So I like the sound of what you're doing. It sounds like the great thing to do. Yeah, I'm totally against the Israeli genocide.
Awesome. But we just want to get rid of Israel, and it's for the Palestinians. Stay off drugs. Well, we would love you to check out our website.
Good luck.
Thank you. If you feel like donating to help the cause, to fight back, and that'd be great.
For sure, we'll definitely.
Maybe consider making a donation. Great.
Probably like $15.
$15? No, that'd be great.
Maybe like 10, 20 bucks.
15 to 20. $5 or $10.
Maybe like $10.
$5. $10. $10. $5 or $10.
$10. Let's say $27, since that seems to be my Bernie donation.
This is all about peace and love. We got to fight back against the oppressors.
I agree.
See you, brother. Yeah, I mean, it's important to kind of fight back and not take it lying down, if you know what I mean. Hey,
Sure,
peace and love.
Yeah, thank you.
Peace and love.
Yeah, peace and love.
See you, man.
Yeah.
Thanks, bro.
Yeah, take it easy.
Appreciate it. Hamas thanks you. I thank you.
Thank you.
Peace and love. You believe peace is important, right?
First.
Of course. But we got to get peace. You first got to destroy some stuff, you know? See you, man.
So that may seem like an exaggeration, but it's not. That's what goes on the American university campuses, and BDS has infiltrated in everywhere from unions to churches to our own Congress. And so to really understand BDS, we're going to need to do two things. We need to talk about anti-Semitism, understand what it is to fight it, and we also need to be able to understand Israel and international law, because BDS, again, is about destroying all of Israel. It is not about the disputed territories in the West Bank. So let's start. Is there a difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? So this is an important question. How do you know when anti-Israel rhetoric crosses over the line into anti-Semitism? If you demonize Israel as the new Nazis, equating Israel with Nazis or Nazi symbols, that is anti-Semitism. If you have a standard against Israel that you don't have against any other country, that's anti-Semitism. Let's do some examples. Human Rights Watch. When you look here, they have Israel apartheid as the #1 human rights issue of 2021, ahead of the million Muslims who are in concentration camps in China, or the Taliban's attack on women's rights. You think about it, Israel, the amount of Jews there are in the world is basically a rounding error for the Chinese census, but the world focus is on Jews and Israel disproportionately. That's anti-Semitism. The UN has anti-Semitism all the time because almost all of its General Assembly resolutions are disproportionately against Israel. So this happened this week. Would Officer Curran still be employed if he posted any other forms of bigotry? So you had a Cleveland police officer who praised Hitler, praised Hamas, a terrorist organization, threatened Jews with violence, and nothing was done against him. He, according to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, lack of any meaningful consequences sends a disturbing message that discrimination against Jews is tolerated and excused. There seems to be a different standard about hate against Jews in the United States as compared to other forms of hate. They're all despicable. However, criticism of Israel that's similar to anything that's done to any other country, that's not anti-Semitic. You just have to open up the Israeli papers to realize how much criticism of Israel is by Israelis more than even elsewhere, but it's legitimate criticism by and large. So it's criticism that is proportionate. And just like my country, the United States, there's plenty to criticize, but overall, it is an amazing country, both countries, but disproportionate criticism goes over the line towards anti-Semitism. And if you delegitimize Israel, that Israel doesn't have a right to exist like every other nation in the UN, that is anti-Semitism. Now, the UN chief specifically said denial of Israel's right to exist is anti-Semitism. And this is from a place that's no great friend of Israel. So this is one of the slides I really want you to remember. This is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism used by our State Department, used by over 30 countries. It says if you demonize Israel, comparing Israel to Nazis, that is anti-Semitism. That person is practicing anti-Semitism. If you have a standard against Israel that you don't have against any other country, or that Israel cannot exist and have a right to self-determination like every other people, that is anti-Semitism. Demonization, double standards, delegitimization. But to fully confront BDS, which is the core of what we're going to be talking about, which challenges Israel's legitimacy, its right to exist in any territorial dimension. I'll prove that to you as we talk about what the founders of BDS say. We need a short history of Israel and international law. So this is a slide just to, I put up very often in a university, and I'll have a student come up and say, find me Iraq. They'll find Iraq, and I'll say, how long has that nation state been there? And I'll show them Syria and Jordan and Israel. And they'll say 1,000 years, 5,000 years. And then I showed them this slide, which is a little more than 100 years ago. And I say, now find me Iraq, Jordan, Syria. You can't, because they were artificially created. And Israel, if you will, even though it's an ancient people coming back to its homeland, was also created at that time. It makes it much more complex. So how did this go? So we're going to do a 2-minute history of Israel. Basically, after World War I, the French and British foreign ministers, they came to an agreement. They were Sykes and Picot, and with Russia also, they divided the Levant, where Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan are, that whole region, Iraq, and they carved them up for their own interests. So initially in 1917, Israel had not just Israel, not just all the West Bank and Gaza, not just every place on pre-post 67, but they also were given Transjordan. But then 5 years later, Jordan became a nation state. It took over 70 to 75% of the landmass, now became part of a purely Sunni Arab state. And that Sunni Arab state that you see on the left, within 25 years, became just this little tiny state. You see the beige areas to your right, and that was pretty indefensible. That was the UN partition plan, UN resolution 181 General Assembly. And Israel accepted this. The Arabs and the Palestinians, who at that time did not refer to themselves as Palestinians, they did not accept the partition plan. Israel declared a state in 48. Within hours, 5 nations, Arab nations, along with the indigenous Arab population, attacked Israel. Israel in counterattack. And you went from the picture on the left that Israel actually gained land. And you can see the beige land, as people refer to it incorrectly, as the 67 lines. They're not the 67 lines. What they are the 1949 armistice line. The Egyptians and the Jordanians refused to call them a border. Israel would have been happy to call them a border. But you can see at that time, you have Gaza and you have the West Bank in the slashed areas on the right. From 49 to 67, those 18 years, and I say 67 because that was the definitive time that really changed a lot of things about Israel, the 67 war, the Six-Day War. There was no Arab state in the West Bank or Arab state of Palestine in the West Bank of Gaza, even though they were controlled by Egypt and Jordan. They wanted them for themselves. There were no accepted borders. There was not a single settlement. So before that 67 war, people have to realize this was a war of annihilation. The head of Egypt, the head of Syria, the head of Iraq talked about wiping Israel off the map, annihilation, destruction. Israel, in a defensive war that they knew that they were going to have to preemptively attack, was able to destroy the Egyptian Air Force and basically was able to defeat the Egyptians, defeat the Syrians, defeat the Jordanians, and you went from the picture on the left, the pre-67 war, to Israel now in control of the Sinai, Gaza, and the West Bank. Israel offered all the land back. People forget this, but the Arab world, the Arab League meeting in Khartoum, said no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations. That could have been the end of it. That was one of many times Israel offered a Palestinian state and was turned down. So what Israel did from 67, the picture on the left, was after the peace with Egypt in the middle, gave back the Sinai, and then after Oslo, and after the Israeli disengagement in 2005, moved out 100% from Gaza and created areas A and B, which were under primarily Palestinian Authority control, and you can see them in red in the West Bank, representing about 40% of the territory there. I just want to remind people, this isn't a territorial conflict. If it was, then this conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians would have ended a long time ago. These are just some of the peace attempts for the international community from 67 to 2005, and there have been many since then. And I will get eventually to the end to tell you why there has not been peace at this point. But I just wanted to give you this as a background. Just remind one thing here. This is literally the Israeli Prime Minister Omer's 2007 picture on PLO stationery with Yasser Arafat, actually not Yasser Arafat, I'm sorry, Mahmoud Abbas, the president, who was the president, still the president, of offering 100% of the West Bank with land swaps and East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital. Supposedly that's everything they want. And they were rejected by Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, who also runs the PLO and Fatah. And that's the actual Omer peace plan. So Palestinians and Israelis see things differently. To the Israelis, they're a little blip in the Middle East surrounded by many hostile nations. To the Palestinians, they believe that all of this land was theirs and that it more and more has been taken from them since 1948. And it's also a story of different narratives. You have the Palestinian refugees and descendants of refugees. There were 600,000 Palestinian refugees who were forced or left on their own, who left Israel. And from Jews, there was more than 850,000, some say 1 million Jews, were forced out of Arab lands that they had been in for millennia. And by the way, not just Arab lands, Muslim lands, because Jews who lived in Iran were also forced out, and Iran is not an Arab country. So with that as a background, we now need to look at a non-politicized version of international law. Anti-Zionism is premised on the theory that Israel is violating international law. And we're going to start with the territories, although I want you to keep in mind that BDS is not, and I think has duped many people into believing that it is just about the disputed occupied territories. BDS is about eliminating all of Israel, and I'll get back to proving that to you in a little bit. So international law, this is the question you should ask. Does Israel have any legal rights over the 67 line? That 67 line is not a border. It's either called the Green Line or 1949 line. Is every Israeli settlement over that 67 line a violation of international law? And that would include the Western Wall and the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. And if Israel also took or was given any land, even in a land swap, it would always be looked at as a thief in the night because it didn't have any legal rights there if that was true. So people who say Israel has no legal rights and everything they do is a violation of international law basically come to Article 49 of the 49 Geneva Convention, and it prohibited the deportation of civilian populations. They claim that the Israelis have deported Israeli citizens into the West Bank. First of all, nobody was actually ever forced. I mean, that is not true. Somebody can make a case that there were economic incentives that were there, but most of the original settlements, people need to remember, were done by the left-wing Labor Party, and they were done for security reasons. And by the way, what makes this a little obscene is that Article 49 of the Geneva Convention was made specifically after World War II about what the Nazis did to the Jews. Now, Israel's defendants say international law is on their side if people just opened their eyes and looked at it through a non-politicized point of view. They say that Article 80 in the UN Charter memorialized everything from the Balfour Declaration to all the things that occurred post-World War I, from the San Remo Declaration, all the things from the League of Nations, and it granted Israel rights in the disputed territories, Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, as you prefer. Maybe the most compelling point about this area, about the West Bank, is that this area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. So the way things work in international law, whoever was the last legal stakeholder has rights to that. The Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore. So it is best described, because there is the last legal stakeholder doesn't exist, as disputed territory. That is not for or against occupations of disputed territories. It's not for or against two-state solutions. This is an unbiased view of what international law says. And the most important legal decision occurred, again, that important point of time of 1967, because 67 is when Israel went from being a victim to being regarded as a victimizer over the last 50 plus years. And what happened was, these are the people who actually introduced or wrote UN Security Council resolution, which almost all the resolutions for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are based upon. including Oslo, which is the only true legal standing one that occurred way back in the early 1990s. 242, we're looking at Lord Caradon, we're looking at who was the British ambassador, we're looking at Arthur Goldberg, the American ambassador, and we're looking at Eugene Rostow, who eventually became dean of the law school. And this is the actual print of what was said, that Israel have withdrawal of Israel's armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. It did not say the territories, and that lack of that indefinite article was purposeful, as these men said on many occasions afterward, because Israel was supposed to live in secure and recognized boundaries, and the 67 lines, or the 49 armistice lines, or the Green Line, they're all synonyms, did not give Israeli secure and defensible boundaries. So the West Bank, in context, not a politicized view, Israel was never supposed to withdraw to an indefensible line. And that's what the authors said. So was this a border or an armistice? People today quickly say it's a border. And when I go to Congress, I have to say, excuse me, it's not a border, whether we want it to be a border, and it could be a border if both parties agree, but it is right now just an armistice line. It's an armistice line because with the people at that time who invaded Israel and Israel offered the territory back, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, after the ceasefire, refused to call it a border. So this is what some of the people said at the time. The vice president of the International Court of Justice, Stephen Schwabel, said, quote, armistice agreements expressly preserve territorial claims of all parties and did not purport to establish definitive boundaries. Lord Caradon, who introduced 242, said, it would have been wrong to demand Israel to return to the June 4th position. The position was undesirable and artificial. It was just an armistice line. And our Joint Chiefs of Staff said, from a strictly military point of view, Israel would require retention of some captured territory to provide military defensible borders. So it doesn't matter your point of view. You could be, Israel should withdraw to that 49 armistice line or not. It may be wise or unwise for Israel to claim all or none or just a part of the territory. But according to a non-politicized reading of international law, Israel is not occupying the territory and has the rights of occupying it until there is a resolution of this disputed territory. Or else Israel's possession, as I said before, of the Western Wall would be considered a war crime. So putting all of that together, anti-Semitism, the history of Israel, and international law, we get to BDS, which is maybe the most lethal weapon of soft power to destroy Israel, up there with the Iranian nuclear bomb. BDS is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So what's the real goal? They present themselves as a peaceful movement, but its real goal is the destruction of all of Israel. So this is the co-founder of BDS, Omar Barghouti. Quote, definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. A Palestine next to a Palestine rather than an Israel next to a Palestine. He calls Israel the worst possible things. It's basically criminally built on ruins of Palestinian society. He is for boycotting all of Israel and wants an unconditional right of return of descendants of Palestinian refugees who now number 5 to 6 million. They are the only people in the world who descendants of refugees in perpetuity are given a claim to go back to their original country. The 850,000 Jews in Israel, who are in the many millions now, do not have that claim to go back to Arab or Muslim lands. In fact, the UN High Commission for Refugees, their goal is to resettle people who are refugees, whether they're Syrian refugees who ended up in Europe, and to end their statelessness. The UNRWA, United Nations Works and Relief Agency, perpetuates the conflict. And that is one of the primary reasons the conflict has not ended. So Barghouti and the whole BDS movement, and I'm going to tell you about the movement in a second, turn Zionism into criminality. They call Israel by every libel, racist, Zionist. It's an apartheid regime, about as bad as you can say, illegitimate. It's a colonialistic ethnic cleanser. anyone who supports Zionism is evil. And you'll see this when we talk about colleges, where you have people who are progressive, who are social justice warriors, but if they are Zionists, they are not allowed to be in that movement because Zionism is immoral. What is BDS? It is the 21st century form of 20th century anti-Semitism. In the 20th century, it was against the individual Jew. Today, it's against the collective Jew, being Israel. Is it a BDS a nonviolent movement? Not quite. They support violent resistance against Israeli civilians. And this is an organization, strategy. It's a Palestinian strategy, and that occurs in the West Bank. The BD and by the West Bank and its affiliates throughout the world, and that it works with. Palestinian BDS National Committee. It's a coordinating body for worldwide BDS to strengthen and spread the culture of boycotting all of Israel. And it explains that Zionism is population transfer, apartheid, and colonialism. And this also is what goes on in a lot of universities today. So who supports this worldwide movement? Qatar is one of the major countries. Qatar is a kind of a frenemy of the United States. They supported the Taliban. They support Salafist Islamist elements. They support Hamas. They have sent billions of dollars into American think tanks, into universities, and now even into primary schools as part of curriculum. They've bought enormous leverage in the next generation of Americans. And a primary goal of theirs is to undermine Israel's right to exist. So who is funding BDS? And we said that it's Qatar is one of the major groups, but who do they fund? AMP, American Muslims for Palestine. This is an important slide. This is Jonathan Schanzer, former Treasury official. This is his testimony before Congress. And he said, former employees of Hamas-linked charities now work for AMP. They are the key sponsor, and this is so important, for SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. They are the #1 organization in the United States, especially on college campuses, to propagate BDS. They provide apartheid walls in universities, speakers, money, training. So why does this have such a receptive audience with our college kids? Well, on college campuses today, it's cool to be anti-Israel. Israel is the big guy. Facts, by the way, in our world are irrelevant. You can go into your safe space and not hear things that make you uncomfortable. Israel was born in sin. It's a colonial enterprise. Colonial enterprises should go down into the wastebasket of history. And that Palestinian people are now made to be analogous to people of color in our country, a persecuted minority. So it's about a Goliath and a David, a victim and a victimizer. Remember that year 67? Israel went from victim to victimizer. Israel is colonialistic, imperialistic, and this is what is taught in many of the Middle East studies courses and many courses throughout the universities. It is infected many other places besides political science or Middle East studies courses. Palestinians are considered a minority, a marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed people. Marginalized groups have to affiliate and support one another. We'll talk about this in the word in a second. It explains, in some way, how LGBTQ supports misogynist Muslim extremists. Explains how Black Lives Matter supports Palestinian Lives Matter, from Ferguson to Gaza, intifada. It's kind of crazy. So you say to yourself, how can people, progressive people, align with homophobia and people who torture gays in the Palestinian society? No problem. Just change the topic. We're going to call it pinkwashing. Israel is only good to the gays to deflect attention from their crime of genocide against the Palestinians. This would be almost laughable if it wasn't true and dangerous. ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt, talking about this year, the 2022 new college year, and ADL is not anywhere an organization that's considered part of the right, said, quote, while we've tracked some increase in white supremacist activity at the college campuses, these actors operate on the margins. Far more prominent and disruptive to Jewish student life is the rise of left-wing extremism. Radical left's increasing normalization of hatred towards Israel and Zionism, and the frequent targeting of Jewish students, American Jewish students, for their support of Israel. The Zionist Jews are called everything as racist, white supremacists. We saw Jews depicted as pigs with dollar signs in their eyes by that group, Students for Justice in Palestine. And they say, Greenblatt says, Jews need to renounce Israel and Zionism to have a place here, is what he says about groups like SJP. So to understand the American college campus, what I just said to you, you need to understand the word intersectionality. Intersectionality is an ideology. It's at the core of BDS and Students for Justice in Palestine. It's the unity of all victimized and oppressed people. Palestinians are the most victimized people on earth. Every victim in the world must ally with Palestinians. And if you ally with Israel and the Zionists, you cannot be part of social justice. Intersectionality is a mindset that allows Israel to be delegitimized, dehumanized. Oppressors versus oppressed, victim versus victimizer. The oppressor is powerful and must be dehumanized. Justice is for the oppressed alone. BDS is the sword against the oppressor, the Zionist. So you say, wait a second, how can these groups explain groups like Hamas, or even the Abbas's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade targeting Israeli civilians? No problem. They claim that all Israelis will one day be in the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, so they're all legitimate targets. What about when they kill their own? They kill their own, sometimes for homophobia, sometimes for alleged collaboration, sometimes because they go up against the authoritarian Palestinian Authority. So Jews are considered white and privileged. Well, in the United States, most Jews are of Ashkenazi origin and are technically white. They're not all privileged. Now, they also claim that Jews are part of systemic oppression of people of color. It's one problem with all of this and Jews who support Israel. The majority of Jewish Israelis, by our definition of people of color, are people of color. They are Mizrahi Jews who came from places like Iran, Sephardic Jews who came from Arab countries and originally were from Spain. There are Jews who are Black from Ethiopia. There are people who have dark skin who are Jews who come from India. So the idea that Jews are white, interestingly enough, you remember the Nazis, what they said were Jews were not white. And that was another reason they were not, their racist type of ideology allowed them to systemically kill the Jews. So this is the debate on college campuses today. I'm from Palestine and I say it's all Israel's fault. And then you have somebody who's a Jewish Israeli or just an American Jew and says, it's all Israel's fault, whether I'm from Israel or I'm Jew, so it can't be anti-Semitism. And then you deal with things like microaggressions. You say a tiny thing you didn't even know you were saying, and you close off a conversation, or you trigger warnings, you trigger somebody, or cultural appropriation or safe spaces. This is what goes on college campuses. So nobody should feel any discomfort in having a conversation. I mean, people go into the law. It's an adversarial approach. You need to hear both sides, even if it's discomforting. It's supposed to go on college campuses and really everywhere is a respectful discourse where you don't attack the other person, but you hear what the other person has to say with an open mind. How many open minds have we encountered in our lives from family, friends, churches, at work? Now, safe space is all part of this culture. It's about not giving people protection. It's about censorship. It's about silencing speech. So under the guise of creating safe spaces, the goal is to censure any ideas that are not politically correct. Zionism is about as unpolitically correct as you can get. And what goes on is we deal with race and identity politics that transformed our education system. I'm going to talk about professors a little bit later, into activism. So this is one of the infamous episodes. Israeli ambassador to America, Michael Oren, was shouted down in California speaking, and the claim, people say, this is free speech. My right to chase somebody off the stage, to scream them down, that's my right to free speech. I mean, this is Orwellian. This is a Palestinian human rights activist, Bassam Eid. He was chased off the stage at the University of Chicago by Students for Justice in Palestine, the major BDS group. This is what he said: BDS, it's totally bullshit. Another organization gaining money and power on the suffering of the Palestinians. As a Palestinian who actually lives in East Jerusalem and hopes to build a better life, this pro-Palestinian activism we could do without. And he says, we need to reconcile with our Israeli neighbors. He was chased out because he talked about reconciliation and a two-state solution. And that was the free speech of the Students for Justice in Palestine and many of their progressive colleagues. So what does some recent surveys from the American Jewish Committee, ADL, Hillel, Brandeis Center say? 50% of American Jewish students hide their identity or support of Israel because they're afraid of being intimidated and not protected by the administrators. 90% of all American Jews, adults included, say anti-Semitism is a big problem. Over 80% of Americans, Jew and Gentile, say that anti-Zionism means anti-Semitism. And by the way, anti-Semitism is the #1 religious hate crime in America, surpassing every other crime, including those against Islam. So how bad is anti-Semitism on the American college campus? Over 50% of Jewish students experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism. Now, during the last administration, the White House tried to strengthen through the Education Department, giving Jewish kids protection under the Civil Rights Act, using that definition I taught you, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition that equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. The anti-Zionists, the BDSers, the far-left progressives say Judaism is only a religion. It should have no national dimension. It's not a race. It does not deserve civil rights protections. It harms our free speech to destroy Israel and to boycott Israel. And for BDS and for Students for Justice in Palestine, is destroying Israel. And that Judaism has no national dimension. So therefore, Israel is not deserving of any land. It is just a religion. So those of you who are atheists out there, and you consider yourself very Jewish, and how does that line up? Remember, Judaism is not just religion. Judaism has a national dimension, civilizational dimension, a traditional dimension. Students for Justice in Palestine, anti-Semitism, it is the strongest predictor of perceiving hostile climate towards Israel and Jews is the presence of Students for Justice in Palestine on campuses. And very often BDS use anti-Zionist Jews to prop up their claim that they can't be. You see the sign, American Jews support BDS, and that's code pink. They say they can't be anti-Semitic because we have Jews who do this. By the way, you could be a Jew and be an anti-Semite. They take people like this professor, Ilan Pop, who's an extreme anti-Zionist and wants Israel destroyed. He says evil Zionism will come to an end as all immoral regimes do. It's a settler colonialistic project. Jewish Israelis are responsible for bringing back. It's their own fault that anti-Semitism's back. So this is something that occurred. I'll show you a quick clip here of BDS and intimidation. We have BDS turning into pure anti-Semitism. This is in Hunter College. Basically hijacking an event that was supposed to be a protest against tuition hikes, and it turned that the Zionists were raising tuition. So let's see if we can just watch a tiny bit of this clip. So again, what we had there was Zionists out of CUNY, the City University of New York, about a protest that was about tuition hikes and Zionism and got Jews and money. It was all in there. It was pure anti-Semitism. Zionism is an ism, and no isms are tolerated. No sexism, no racism, no Zionism. There are no safe spaces for Jewish kids like there are for a lot of other kids. So at NYU a couple of years ago, under the doors of Jewish students, whether they were pro-Israel or not, they got eviction notice saying this is what goes on in the Palestinian territories from Israeli authorities. In Colombia, there was a meeting on sexual assault. They tied it to Israel. And academic departments are a big driver here. We have the administrators who don't protect Jewish kids and the academics with tenure who can say the most racist things against Jews that you can imagine. And big part is because academic departments are now become activist departments. The greater the BDS activity on a college campus that involves faculty, the more anti-Semitism there is on a college campus. Education nowadays, unfortunately, on many campuses has taken a backseat to political indoctrination. The professors are more activists than they are educators. Activism demands political correctness. Zionism is not politically correct, and everything in the discourse is seen through a political filter. So this happened this month, blatant anti-Semitism at Berkeley School of Law. What happened? They had a pledge not to invite any pro-Israel or Zionist speaker to campus. Quote, we will not invite speakers in support of Zionism, the apartheid state of Israel, and they're trying to make this a national movement. That's pure anti-Semitism. So who else is part of this? You have the Association for Asian American Studies, Native American Studies, Critical Ethnic Studies Association, the National Women's Studies Association. The National Women's Studies Association wants a total boycott of Israel, BDS, not just about the disputed territories. Israel imposes apartheid, total boycott, divestment, and sanctions of economic, military, and cultural entities and projects sponsored by the state of Israel. It's Orwellian because and they talk about Israel perpetuates sexual and gender-based violence against the Palestinians, which is a total untruth, but there is a good amount of misogyny in the Palestinian society. Where else is BDS? Unions. My organization, Stand With Us, where I was the chair for 10 years, would fight in American unions, international unions, where the BDS would come in and groups, and they would try to get BDS stuff introduced to boycott Israeli companies. Here's Norway's largest union. They want a full international boycott of Israel, not disputed territories. BDS is about boycotting all of Israel, to destroy Israel. The Quakers, they always sound so benign, but they have been for the last 60 years obsessed with Israel. They've wanted an embargo against Israel going back to the 70s, and they work with something called JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace. Do not be fooled. Jewish Voice for Peace is a profoundly anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist organization, and the Quakers work with them to indoctrinate the next generation of kids. The Methodists, the largest Protestant union, has blacklisted 5 Israeli banks, similar to what they do to North Korea. Double standard, anti-Semitism. And I want to get to the malicious charge of apartheid. This is Amnesty International. They make no bones about what they want. They don't want an Israel. We are opposed to the idea that Israel should be preserved as a state of the Jewish people. They want to destroy Israel. This is a group that's in favor of calling Israel apartheid, to destroy Israel. Remember what apartheid is? This heinous government that created apartheid. It was about prohibition of marriage between the races, prohibition of sex between the races, prohibition of a black from skilled work, prohibiting blacks from voting, prohibiting blacks from striking. What the heck does this have to do, apartheid, with Israel? The International Red Cross, not always a great friend of Israel. This is the head who said, there's no apartheid in Israel. It's not a regime based on superiority of one race over another. Mansour Abbas, an Islamist who was part of the Israeli government, said Israel is not an apartheid state. A human rights professor at Harvard says it is a big lie. Labeling Israel an apartheid state is simply a deliberate attempt to undermine the legitimacy of the Jewish state itself and basically destroy it. So I mentioned Mansour Abbas, who you see on your right. You could also see on the left a Palestinian citizen of Israel, Khaled Kaboub, who is what some people call Israeli Arab, was just appointed to the Supreme Court. Did this occur in South Africa? But if you really want to know in this area who might be an aspiring apartheid state, it's the Palestinian Authority that Mahmoud Abbas says he does not want a single Israeli, which is interchangeable for Jew, on or living on Palestinian land. So I want to just go back to the beginning. I want to show 2 slides before we go on about why this conflict hasn't been resolved. Most Israelis view this conflict as a conflict between 2 national movements. Logic leads to 2 states for 2 peoples. To the Palestinians, and I go to Ramallah, I talk to Palestinians, I talk to Fatah. To Palestinians, it is not 2 national movements, but a legitimate Palestinian movement and an illegitimate Zionist colonialistic entity. Judaism is a religion, not legitimate. It's a national movement of Zionism that's not legitimate. And why this conflict has not resolved? Because the Palestinians cannot give up their unconditional right of return, the descendants of refugees, which would be the demographic destruction of Israel. The Palestinians, in any agreement, will not sign an end of conflict agreement to say that Israel has any right to land over the 67 line, even within Israel, because it once was Islamic land. And they won't, and they have not prepare their people that they too are going to need to make painful compromises accepting a Jewish state, unlike the people and the Arabs and the Sunni Arabs in the Gulf states who have accepted a Jewish state. So here's a little different approach. You could work with people who are pro-Palestinian and they're progressives. You could say, are you in favor of women's rights? Are you in favor of freedom of the press? Are you in favor of religious tolerance? Are you in favor of gay rights? Are you in favor of freedom of speech? Are you in favor of democracy? Well, then, by definition, you're a supporter of Israel. Where could a LGBTQ parade take place in anywhere in the Middle East except in Israel? If you're a Palestinian gay and you're happy and alive, you're living in Tel Aviv. You're not living in the Palestinian Authority. You're hiding. So BDS has been fought at the state level in New York, in New Jersey. It's been fought in Congress. This was one going back to 2015. Rob Portman, whose office I work with, Ben Cardin, Democrat and Republican here. They wanted to make U.S. negotiations a rejection of BDS as part of the principal part of our trade. People have fought against this. Progressives in the Senate and the House have saying this limits their right to boycott, which is not true. How can you fight and win against BDS? First thing is, you need to become educated. Memorize that State Department definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Personal stories that if you visited Israel, of what you've seen, are much more compelling than just stating facts. Making that Israel connection for people, because most people in this country don't have a strong feeling one way or another about Israel. But if they're interested in cooking, bring over Israeli chefs. If they're interested in film, bring over Israeli filmmakers. Make that connection with Israel. Build partnerships in communities. Reach out. If you're also in universities, reach out to Latino, African American, computer science courses, theater groups, and build commonality with groups that happen to also be pro-Israel and share the same social justice views as you do. Talk about Israel's humanitarian record. It is so amazing. Social justice is totally compatible with being a supporter of Israel. Israel's always been the first, whether it's rescue teams in Turkey, Pakistan, Japan during Fukushima, the nuclear plant, first functioning mobile hospital, what happened after the devastation in Haiti, saving Ethiopian refugees. Israel's the first and only country in the history of the world to airlift tens of thousands of Black men, women, and children to become full and free citizens. It's not. To call Israel an apartheid state and do something like this is an obscenity. Israel is repairing the ice. This is one of their projects in the world, bringing a sight around the world. This is in Myanmar, in Vietnam, and other developing nations. Israel has brought back people who can walk, who were confined to wheelchairs with something called Rewalk. It has given people who had no functioning arms, 3D magic printed arms to develop an exoskeleton. Israel is saving lives and giving teaching people how to fish all over the world with desalination, agricultural development, drip irrigation. It's a world leader in water technology here. You see this in South Africa, an Israeli project. This is more medical research. We in America share values with Israel. Why are Americans such great friends? There's a new book that just came out called The Ark of the Covenant by a Bard professor, talking about why Americans share the values of America are so much in commonality with Israel. We share core values of rule of law, religious freedom, freedom of speech, democracy. Israel is the only democracy, certainly liberal democracy, in the Middle East. I'm going to end this over here. And I think I'm just going to bring up how to fight on college campuses, how to fight in your organization, how to get the education. I strongly recommend reaching out to Stand With Us. This is an amazing organization that has done fantastic work in fighting anti-Semitism, protecting Jewish kids, fighting racism. Also has done tremendous amount in fighting when after Israel is attacked in the world on social media. Hillels have done great work, Jewish federations, American Jewish Committee. Find your place and use them as speakers and come in to teach your kids in middle school. This BDS world is getting into middle school nowadays. Stand With Us is working not only in colleges, not only with organizations, but in high schools and now middle schools and soon in primary schools. If you would like to be in contact with me, I do write back. If you can email mepin@mepinanalysis.org. Please join our website. I write for The Hill. I write for The Sun. I write for the Jerusalem Post. I'm the senior security editor of the Jerusalem Report. I write for JNS. I write for many publications. I talk more on international world. I talk a lot about Iran. I was very involved in that. So a lot of the work I'm writing is there. But this is one of the things I am passionate about and been doing for many years. Fighting anti-Semitism in all its forms, because I believe as an American that is incredibly important to fight all forms of hate. So I thank you, and certainly reach out to me.